Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, and many thanks to Elena and to Aidan and the whole Refugee Hosts team for the invitation. Your project has been a constant source of inspiration and motivation over the last few years, so it really is a great honor and pleasure to be here. 1951. In 1951, the International Refugee Organization, what is now UNHCR, released a set of 78 RPM discs called The Refugees Sing, featuring recordings made in refugee camps across Europe after World War II. In the liner notes, the IRO Director General, Donald Kingsley, made a claim for the voices contained therein as heralding a world in the making. These are the voices of the refugees themselves, he writes, recorded in the camps where they lived suspended between two worlds. It is more than music, it is the voice of an age, the age of the refugee. I start here not because I want to echo these exact same arguments, but rather because they open a few ideas that I want to play with today. First, that music and sound have long been enrolled in migrations and representations of migrations, and that humanitarian narratives are recursive, repeating, looping, and feeding back on themselves through history. Second, that the trope of the refugee voice is also not new, but continues to be based on the idea that refugees are speaking for themselves, which is very often not the case. And third, that attending to voices, not just as a metaphor for agency, but as things that make sound, opens ways of reimagining how political subjectivities are made and remade. Today, I will ask how listening can disrupt humanitarian narratives, how it enables us to think about emplacement as much as displacement, how it opens creative engagements with representation and is at once an access point to the agency of people who have crossed borders, and a means of hearing the policies and colonialities that compel these movements in the first place. Sounds have politics. Sounds are enrolled in regimes of citizenship, playing a key but largely unheard role in debates about freedom of movement. Sound can be a tool of storytelling that resists what Arundhati Roy calls the tyranny of crisis reportage, and that captures both the poetics and politics of belonging. I begin in the middle of things, thinking through the politics of refugee voices that dominate current humanitarian campaigns. I'll then shift to my own work in Athens and some sonic collaborations and creative citizenships there. I'll close by speaking directly to the conference theme of local responses to displacement by offering the idea of refugee feedback. I'll jump right into the politics of representation. Current representations of displacement often focus on refugee voices, individual stories, in efforts to stimulate sympathy. For anthropologist Heath Cabot, some refugees are very marketable and therefore useful for humanitarian campaigns. But these voices are filtered through an aura of victimhood and are thus silenced as critical and active subjects, even as advocates carve out space for them. Refugee voices stories then serve to abstract and homogenize, depoliticizing displacement, rendering refugees as an ahistorical human category. And this fits into a broader culture of storytelling that, for Sujatha Fernandez, follows neoliberal logics and presents carefully curated narratives with predetermined storylines as a tool of philanthropy, statecraft, and advocacy. Under these conditions, complexities, histories, ambiguities, and political struggles go missing, and in all cases, agency is denied. Instead, we're served up reductive prototypes of flight, suffering, and refugeeness. And these countless individual stories, to borrow another point from Fernandez, create a polyvocal fabric that insulates the master narrative from critique, which in this case means the regimes and colonialities that produce and police borders and that make refugees in the first place. We need 2 points here. First, this idea then of giving voice is usually little more than a political ventriloquism, a discursive sleight of hand in which voices are selectively called upon and then silenced. Second, discussions of refugee voices tend to focus only on voice as a metaphor for agency, forgetting that voices also do a lot of work as sounding entities, voices as sonic phenomena, voice as what Amanda Wiedemann calls deeply felt markers of class, race, geographical origin, or what Kathleen Stewart posits as some vast array of fictions, some grooves of imagined somethings scored onto saliva and the sound of waves. The combined effect is that these refugee voices' tropes get nowhere near the sensory lived experiences of everyday life. Voices carry the border within their timbres. Voices exceed the space given to them by humanitarian narratives, exceed the framings of victimhood and idealization. What happens when we listen? How can working with sound open creative engagements with representing displacement, finding spaces of narrativity that have not yet been claimed and foreclosed, and distorting the dominant tropes of, heavy quote marks here, refugee crisis? Partly this is to do with countering the dominance of visual forms of representation that have created many of these tragic tropes in the first place, framing eternal victimhood, constructing spectacles of suffering, encouraging aid rather than activism. Partly it's to do with unmaking hierarchies of sensory knowledge. Take, for instance, the integral place of sound and listening in Islamic culture, which finds a means of self-expression in hearing and acting. And partly it's because sounds are always moving and can help us rethink society itself through movement, contributing towards efforts to de-exceptionalize displacement and offering an access point to the agency of people who have crossed borders. If we let Athens come into earshot, we can think about how narratives of displacement gather and unsettle in the city which has become a border, which in turn takes shape as a site of creativity. Athens has been a testing ground, or maybe a dumping ground, for European experiments in border management since long before 2015. Border closures and restricted freedom of movement keep people in the city, which in turn compels a shift in focus from experiences of displacement to practices of emplacement. In Athens, I work with people who resist and rethink refuginess. Careful with my mixing. We make collaborative sound recordings in the city, listening to rhythms and encounters that populate everyday life. The sounds we are hearing now come from a recording project from 2017, when I worked with friends from Greece, Syria, and Afghanistan to produce a sound essay of movement and encounter in Athens, which we published on the Refugee Hosts blog. Thank you again, Elena and Aidan. The result was probably a bit opaque, but then people, particularly those seeking refuge, have the right to opacity. These are not refugee stories. Voices come and go, shout and scatter. Narratives flicker and flee. At no point is it clear which sounds are Greek and which are refugee. Instead, everything migrates. This encouraged me to think about how places sound different depending on where you come from, how sound stimulates solidarities and frictions between communities, and how sound is even a way of understanding citizenship, of hearing inclusion and exclusion. How, for Turnke, Duro, and Park, citizenship is a constant process produced through the senses and their perceived naturalization. And how people use music and sound to assert belonging in the face of asylum regimes, racialized persecution, and border politics that play out in urban space. Since then, we've been developing these practices. At the beginning of this year, I was invited to join the core team of an activist collective in Athens, the Syrian and Greek Youth Forum, and together we've been doing workshops on recording the city and citizenship, using sound as a catalyst for narration, and sharing the skills to produce media. We're building a sound archive and working on radio programs and museum installations, both in the UK and in Athens, as part of bigger goals of community building and political inclusion. The directions this work has taken come from what I think of as activist lessons, things I've learned from my Syrian colleagues who tell me that life as they experience it is very different from life as it is reported by the media, who tell me that we have a responsibility to record what is happening in Athens, both to try and fix damaging narratives about refugees and for future historians wanting to know what was happening at street level in this moment. These contested representations map onto different ways of conceptualizing citizenship. There's an Arabic proverb that states, if you stay among people for 40 days, you become one of them. Syrian people living in Athens for the past 3 or 4 years have developed a sense of belonging that extends way beyond this time frame. They reject the tropes of refuginess that constitute them as vulnerable victims and instead insist upon being called active citizens. These activisms have a soundtrack, and I'd like to play for you now, with the blessing of my colleagues at the Syrian and Greek Youth Forum, a song that they have written to articulate their experiences and the situation in Greece. The team recorded and sent this to me yesterday to share with you. Shukran Wael, Karim, Safi Ayman. The song is called Hurriye, or Freedom, and I'll let my own voice recede now to make space for theirs.
ربي وحده الجبار العالم في حاله قاهرنا بالمخيمات عايم في حاله ربي وحده الجبار العالم في حاله شناتينا عليك من حارة لحارة لاستوعبك يكفينا إنا جبارا اليوم وقفنا باب الوزارة يوم النية وبسمنا نص العبارة جينا اليوم ووقفنا باب الوزارة ضحكة والنية وبسمنا نص العبارة حرية نحن أهل الحرية اسمعي مني يا يونان هدفنا إنسانية حرية نحن أهل الحرية اسمعي مني يا يونان هدفنا إنسانية
I'm just going to take a couple of more minutes to say a couple of final points. In the song, we hear a musical activism in which the community's perspective and politics are made audible. We hear agency and creativity and resistance. We hear the backdrop of regimes and the struggle for freedom. We hear a playfulness with language. Mirhara in Greek means something very positive, while in Arabic it means something completely opposite. We hear a movement to be part of conversations on political inclusion. The SGYF team performed this song at political and cultural events, at festivals and other musical performances, in public space and on the street. Musical performance and the struggle for political rights are indivisible, with each constantly opening and folding back into the other. The border spectacle that marks the current moment in political history is remade and creatively transformed into an anti-border spectacle of musical performance in the city. In other words, people perform and protest citizenship, and citizenship itself is remade as something emergent and iterative, something adaptive and activist, something disruptive and creative. And we need to recognize and amplify these creativities, not just creativities in the sense of the performing arts like music, but the creativities that are a necessary part of everyday life. Representations of displacement should be equally creative and disruptive. What if, then, we stop thinking in terms of refugee voices and repeating humanitarian tropes that strip away politics and agency, and start thinking in terms of refugee feedback? This term developed through conversations with friends and colleagues in Athens who tell me how the creativities that abound in refugee communities feed back into host societies and contribute to developments in broader urban culture, who tell me how histories of movement and refuge exist in a feedback loop and how cultures develop through circulation, encounter, and exchange, who use the city as a sounding board of solidarity and a resonance chamber for protest, generating feedback by making audible the violence of borders and exclusionary regimes of belonging. If we put all this together, we can hear how migrant activisms and sonic strategies are not just about claiming space, but are enrolled in the very remaking of the city. Creative citizenship practices remake the logics of the urban landscape and soundscape through the production of common spaces, reclaiming vocabularies of integration, unmaking borders between citizens and non-citizens, between refugees and hosts. What does all this mean for humanitarian narratives? One final point to finish. Listening with displacement and emplacement means collaboration and co-production of knowledge. It means going beyond now commonplace calls to recognize refugee agency or to invoke refugee voices without really listening to what those voices are saying or doing. It means populating and unsettling stories and retelling them as gatherings of experiences. As Fernandez puts it, we need to reclaim storytelling as a craft that allows for the fullness and complexity of experience to be expressed, and which seeks to transform rather than reproduce global hierarchies and structures of power through movements for social change. And all of this means allowing for the messiness and creativity of life across borders to overtake reductive tropes of refugeeness. Sounding stories opens ways of doing this, and I thank you very much for listening.